September 19th, 1943, Bougainville Airfield, Solomon Islands. The morning heat shimmered across the runway, bending the air into ripples of silver. Rows of F-4U Corsairs sat silent, their wings folded like resting birds. Beneath them, the ground smelled of oil, cordite, and jungle rot. Mechanics moved between aircraft, their faces streaked with sweat and grease. Tired men holding together the thin line between victory and disaster. From the sky came a low thunder, distant engines, fading fast. Then the scream. A Corsair spiraled through a column of smoke, trailing black fire, its pilot's voice crackling over the radio before vanishing into static. The impact shook the trees beyond the airfield. Another plane gone. Another Marine dead. Watching from the edge of the tarmac stood a 26-year-old ordnance mechanic named Staff Sergeant Michael "Mickey" McCarthy. He wasn't a pilot, wasn't an officer, just a man with a wrench and a mind that refused to accept defeat. Around him, gunfire echoed from far off in the jungle. Above, the air shimmered with the ghosts of missed shots, thousands of wasted rounds. McCarthy stared at the wreckage and whispered to no one, "It shouldn't take this many bullets to kill one man." That night, he would prove it. By the late summer of 1943, the Pacific sky had become a graveyard. Every week, more American planes fell, not because they were weak, but because they were missing. The U.S. Marine Corps' F-4U Corsair was supposed to be unstoppable. It was the fastest prop-driven fighter in the Pacific, capable of 400 miles per hour, with 650 caliber Browning machine guns mounted in its wings. The same guns that could shred a bomber in seconds. On paper, it was perfection. In combat, it was frustratingly inefficient. The problem was simple, but deadly. Bullets weren't hitting their targets. In the Solomon Islands campaign, Marine squadrons like VMF 2113, the Hellhawks, were burning through ammunition faster than logistics could resupply it. On average, a Corsair pilot expended nearly 900 rounds for every confirmed kill. An unsustainable ratio when every mission meant flying hundreds of miles over open ocean. Captain James "Jimmy" Sweat, one of the Hellhawks' best pilots, had seen it firsthand. His gun camera film told the story. Perfect aim, textbook burst, and yet, tracers slicing past Japanese Zero fighters without hitting anything vital. The spread was too wide, the convergence too distant. The Corsair's guns were factory set to converge at 1,000 feet, meaning all 6 barrels were angled slightly inward so their bullets met at a single point far ahead. In theory, this ensured maximum range. In practice, most dogfights in the Pacific occurred at 300 to 400 feet, close enough to see the enemy pilot's face. At those distances, the Corsair's bullet pattern was a scattershot of missed opportunities. Pilots were flying death machines that couldn't kill efficiently, and the Japanese had noticed. Intercepted radio transmissions mocked the Americans' shooting. Their bullets scatter like rain. Stay close. When they run dry, strike. Marine Command was alarmed. General Roy Geiger, head of the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, demanded answers. "We have the best aircraft in the theater," he told his officers. "We are losing because we cannot hit what we shoot at." The engineers blamed the pilots. The pilots blamed the guns. The truth was buried in the math. Each Corsair carried roughly 3,000 rounds total, 25 seconds of continuous fire. A Marine pilot, often flying under G-force, stress, and adrenaline, had just a few seconds to aim and shoot. At 1,000 feet convergence, the bullets spread over an area nearly 30 feet across. The Japanese Zero, with its narrow frame and light armor, could slip through the gaps untouched. To make matters worse, The Zero's agility allowed Japanese pilots to outmaneuver heavier American planes at close range. Every missed burst meant a potential counterattack. Every wasted second meant death. By September, Marine fighter squadrons in the Solomon Islands had reached a breaking point. Pilots were frustrated, ordnance crews exhausted, and command desperate. On the ground, amid the chaos of maintenance tents and ammunition crates, one mechanic had been quietly watching. Staff Sergeant Mickey McCarthy wasn't supposed to be part of tactical discussions. His job was maintenance: load the guns, clean the barrels, make sure nothing jams. But McCarthy had something few others did: time to observe. He saw the gun camera footage. He read the after-action reports. He listened to pilots curse their guns after every mission. And slowly, the pattern emerged in his mind. The problem wasn't courage, nor accuracy, nor the aircraft itself. It was geometry, the simple, unchanging laws of angle and distance. Every bullet missed because someone, somewhere, had chosen a number, 1,000 feet, that no longer belonged to the reality of Pacific air combat. That realization would transform him from a maintenance man into one of the most consequential unsung engineers. In marine aviation history, he didn't hold rank enough to change doctrine. He didn't have permission to alter equipment. But on September 18, 1943, as the sun went down over Bougainville, he picked up his tools and prepared to break the rules that were killing his friends. Inside the maintenance hangar, under a single flickering bulb, McCarthy studied the Corsair's wings as though they were a problem waiting to be solved. The air was thick with the metallic tang of oil and gunpowder residue. Empty shell casings littered the concrete like brass confetti, the debris of failure. McCarthy opened the Corsair's technical manual, its pages stiff from tropical humidity. Most enlisted men never read it beyond cleaning procedures, but McCarthy wasn't most men. He wanted to understand how these guns thought, how their mechanical precision could betray human intention. The manual confirmed what he already suspected: factory harmonization at 1,000 feet. He traced the diagram with his finger, then calculated the firing geometry in his head. Using the same kind of back-of-the-napkin trigonometry he'd once used tuning car engines in his father's garage in South Boston. He realized something astonishing. At 1,000 feet, a Zero flying 300 miles per hour could move nearly 440 feet before the bullets even arrived. The math was merciless. Pilots weren't missing because they couldn't aim. They were missing because time and distance conspired against them. He set his jaw and thought, what if the bullets met sooner? A shorter convergence, say 300 feet, would mean that all 6 guns focused their fire into a dinner plate-sized kill zone at the exact range where most combat actually occurred. The impact would be devastating. A single 1-second burst from a Corsair's 6 Brownings could pour over 40,000 foot-pounds of energy into a target the size of a cockpit. That wasn't just concentrated fire. That was vaporization. There was, of course, a reason no one had done it. The engineers at Vought Aircraft had warned repeatedly. Anything below 500 feet convergence risked cracking the gun mounts, twisting the wings, or even tearing the aircraft apart under recoil. Orders from Lieutenant Colonel William Millington, the group operations officer, were explicit. Gun convergence below 500 feet exceeds safe structural limits. Do not modify factory harmonization under any circumstances. McCarthy knew it by heart. And ignored it. That night, he rolled Captain James Sweat's Corsair, Bureau number 117883, into the hangar with 2 trusted armorers, Corporal Eddie Wilkins and Private Tommy Reyes. They worked by lamplight, sweating through their undershirts as they loosened the mounting bolts that controlled each gun's angle. Factory settings pointed each weapon inward, just a few degrees. McCarthy increased it by roughly 2.4 degrees, adjusting the trajectory so that all 6 bullets would cross at 300 feet. With a 2 not 1,000. He reinforced the brackets with steel plates cut from a damaged wing panel, filed by hand, welded into place. Crude, but solid. To test alignment, he built a wooden frame out of scrap lumber, marking it exactly 300 feet down the runway. One by one, he bore-sighted each gun, using the same alignment tricks he'd once used on car headlights. 2 reflections meeting at one point. By 0400 hours, the modification was complete. He test-fired into the ocean. 20 rounds per gun. The sound tore through the night. A thunderclap that echoed over the dark water. No cracks, no fractures, no failures. The gun mounts held. When Captain Sweat arrived at dawn, he stopped cold at the sight of his aircraft. The guns looked wrong, angled sharply inward, like a predator ready to strike. "McCarthy," he said slowly, "what did you do to my guns?" "Adjusted the convergence, sir." "To what distance?" 300 feet. Sweat's silence hung heavy in the humid air. "You know that's against regulation?" he asked. "Yes, sir," McCarthy replied. "And if this doesn't work, we both get court-martialed." McCarthy nodded. "Yes, sir." Sweat looked at the guns, then at the mechanic standing defiantly beside them. "And if it does work," McCarthy allowed himself a thin smile, "then you're going to kill everything you look at." Sweat climbed into the cockpit without another word. The propeller spun, the engine roared to life, and as the Corsair lifted off into the blue Pacific sky, McCarthy watched it vanish into the clouds. The first test flight of a weapon that would soon redefine air combat. Staff Sergeant Mickey McCarthy wasn't supposed to change history. He wasn't even supposed to have an opinion. In a world defined by rank and regulation, his job was to follow orders, load ammunition, keep the guns clean, and stay out of the way. But war has a way of stripping away hierarchy until only necessity remains. In the months before Bougainville, McCarthy had watched too many pilots die. He'd seen their empty planes wheeled back to the hangars, their names quietly crossed off rosters. To him, each death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a mechanical failure. Something wasn't working, and nobody seemed willing to fix it. He had no engineering degree, no laboratory, and no approval. What he did have was intuition, the kind that comes from thousands of hours around engines and weapons. The same instinct that told him when a carburetor was misaligned or when a firing pin was a fraction off-center. When he looked at the Corsair's wings, he didn't see factory precision. He saw wasted potential. He saw survival locked behind a few bolts and a few degrees of angle. That was what made McCarthy dangerous. Not his rank, but his refusal to believe that something was good enough when men were dying because of it. His fellow mechanics described him as quiet, meticulous, and unshakably calm. He never raised his voice, one recalled, but when he worked, you listened. He made machines obey him. And though history would forget his name, that night, in the dim light of the hangar, Satantiu, Mickey McCarthy, became something no manual could define. The kind of Marine who changes the outcome of a war without ever pulling a trigger. In aerial combat, milliseconds decide everything. The difference between victory and death can be the blink of an eye or the angle of a gun. McCarthy's modification changed the very nature of how Marine pilots fought. By bringing the gun's convergence down from 1,000 feet to 300, he transformed the Corsair from a long-range hunter into a close-range executioner. Before the modification, pilots had to fire early and hope the enemy flew into their cone of fire. Now, they could close in, squeeze the trigger, and deliver instant destruction. Tactically, it turned dogfights into ambushes. Japanese pilots were trained to exploit American inaccuracy, weaving through bursts, baiting Corsairs to overshoot. But after the modification, that tactic became suicide. At 300 feet, there was no escape. 1 second of fire, 80 rounds, could shred a Zero's fuselage, rip its wings apart, and detonate its fuel tanks. The Corsair's nickname changed quietly among pilots. It wasn't just whistling death anymore. Some called it the grinder. The new tactics spread fast. Get close, stay steady, don't waste a bullet. Pilots who once fired in panic now fired with surgical precision. The radio chatter changed from frustration to exhilaration. "Solid hits," one pilot reported. "Feels like a cannon, not a gun." On the ground, commanders noticed another benefit: ammunition efficiency. Where one mission used to consume 90% of a pilot's ammo, the new setup left them returning with half their belts still full. That meant more time in the air, more kills per sortie, and fewer resupply flights under enemy fire. In the words of one Marine operations officer, "We didn't just change a setting, we changed the rhythm of the war." To a casual observer, McCarthy's adjustment seemed simple. A few bolts turned, a few degrees altered. But the mechanical reality was anything but simple. The Corsair's 6 Browning M2 machine guns were mounted deep within the wings, each one offset slightly from the next. Any change in convergence required precise recalibration, the kind usually done by engineers with jigs and measurement equipment. McCarthy had none of that. He used scrap steel to reinforce the gun brackets, hand-filed shims to adjust angles, and built a crude aiming rig using a broken propeller hub as a reference point. His welding was rough but strong. Every plate, every bolt, was placed with purpose. He also understood the gun's limitations. The M2 was air-cooled. In flight, the wind dissipated heat. On the ground, during test fires, overheating could destroy a barrel in minutes. So McCarthy fired short bursts, feeling the metal vibrate beneath his hands, listening to the rhythm of recoil. When the guns held after the first test, he didn't celebrate. He didn't even smile. He just nodded. The quiet confidence of a man who knew that math and instinct had aligned. In an official sense, it was illegal. In a practical sense, it was genius. Within hours of its first flight, the modification proved so effective that it began spreading across the Pacific through whispers and word of mouth. Pilots who heard about it sent requests back to base. "We want the McCarthy setting." Unbeknownst to him, McCarthy had just created one of the earliest examples of field-driven technological innovation in modern military history. "You don't ride redan," the bottom-up engineering that would later define U.S. combat doctrine. He didn't design a new weapon. He made the existing one do its job better than anyone thought possible. From that hangar in Bougainville, one man's idea was about to leap from blueprint to battlefield. And in the skies above the Pacific, it would turn numbers, theories, and desperation into something brutally real. In the rigid machinery of the U.S. military, innovation rarely comes from below. Orders flow downward. Obedience flows up. But Bougainville in 1943 was not a place for bureaucracy. It was a place for survival. When Captain James Sweat landed his Corsair after that first test flight, he was mobbed before he even cut the engine. Pilots, mechanics, and officers crowded around his aircraft, staring at the twisted angles of the gun barrels. McCarthy stood quietly in the back, his hands blackened from oil and heat. Sweat climbed down, helmet still on, his voice half laugh, half disbelief. 5 kills, he said. 2 minutes. Use 200 rounds. Silence. The math didn't make sense until they saw the film. The gun camera footage showed Japanese planes disintegrating midair, their wings folding like paper. Each burst looked like a solid beam of light, tracers so dense they appeared as one continuous line. Major Wade Britt, the squadron commander, was stunned. Lieutenant Colonel Millington, the same officer who had forbidden close convergence, was furious. Regulations had been broken, authority ignored. The debate erupted right there on the tarmac. Millington demanded charges. Britt cut him off. "Colonel, if it works, court-martial me. If it doesn't, the Japanese will kill us anyway." That moment defined a quiet revolution. Command was learning what war had already taught the men on the ground. Sometimes, survival means breaking the rules written in peacetime. Within 24 hours, Britt gave a single history-changing order. Every Corsair, 300 feet by dawn. McCarthy didn't salute. He just nodded, rolled up his sleeves, and got to work. By morning, every Corsair in VMF 2 Bougainville had been reborn, armed not just with firepower, but with defiance. For the Japanese pilots over the Solomon Islands, the shift was immediate and terrifying. They had once called the Corsair a clumsy beast. Fast, yes, but inaccurate. The Zero could dance around its fire, teasing it until the American ran out of ammunition. That arrogance died the day the first McCarthy-modified Corsairs took to the sky. Intercepted Japanese transmissions painted the picture. Their bullets no longer scatter. They strike as one. Do not engage below 500 meters. If you see the blue fighter, dive away. The new fire pattern left no room for evasion. The first bursts hit so hard that Japanese aircraft broke apart before pilots could even react. Their wooden fuselages and fabric wings couldn't withstand that concentrated kinetic force. One captured Japanese pilot, interrogated weeks later, described it with awe and horror. "Before, we could dodge the rain. Now, the rain is a wall." In a matter of weeks, the skies themselves changed character. The Americans, once the hunted, became the predators. Japanese escorts began refusing combat unless they held numerical superiority. The balance of the Pacific Air War, delicate and deadly, began to tilt. The innovation had crossed an invisible line. It wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. For the first time, Japanese pilots feared the Corsair. McCarthy's story wasn't just about engineering, it was about courage in defiance. But courage, in war, is never simple. He hadn't set out to kill more efficiently. He'd set out to stop watching his friends die. And yet, his success created a weapon so powerful that it multiplied destruction beyond anything the engineers had intended. Historians would later call it a masterpiece of practical engineering. Veterans called it something else: the storm. In after-action reports, pilots described what it felt like to fire the modified guns. "It wasn't shooting anymore," one said. It was erasing. The Corsair's 6 Brownings, now synchronized at lethal range, didn't just hit it too. They consumed. McCarthy's invention was a paradox of war, an act of compassion that increased the killing power of an already devastating weapon. Decades later, a surviving Marine summarized it best: "He made it so we could go home." But to do that, a lot of others couldn't. That is the moral gravity of innovation in wartime. Every improvement in survival is also an improvement in destruction. Every act of ingenuity carries blood in its shadow. McCarthy didn't speak about what he'd done. He didn't have to. The results spoke for him. Every time a Corsair returned home, riddled but flying, carrying a pilot who should have been dead. In the ledger of war, the balance is never clean. But for those few months in 1943, one mechanic's decision saved hundreds of lives at the cost of thousands more. And so, as Bougainville's airfields roared with the thunder of takeoffs, the Pacific skies prepared to witness something they had never seen before: a weapon so brutally precise it would alter the outcome of an entire campaign. September 19, 1943, 830 hours, Bougainville. The humid air trembled under the roar of engines. 4 Corsairs lifted off from the airstrip, their propellers clawing through the tropical haze. Captain James Sweat led the formation, his aircraft, Bureau number 17883, freshly modified, its 6 Brownings now aligned for 300 feet of convergence. Below, McCarthy stood on the edge of the tarmac, shielding his eyes from the glare, unsure whether he'd just saved his squadron or doomed them. Minutes later, high above Empress Augusta Bay, the Marines made contact. A formation of 9 Japanese Zeros and 6 Val dive bombers appeared out of the morning sun, cutting a line toward Allied positions. The odds were terrible, 4 against 15. Sweat's voice crackled through the radio, calm, deliberate. 213, tally-ho. He dove from 18,000 feet. The wind howled through the Corsair's gull wings as the altimeter spun. At 1,000 yards, he held fire. At 500, still nothing. He was closing fast, dangerously fast. The Zero began to twist, anticipating the attack. Sweat waited until the last heartbeat. At 300 feet, he pressed the trigger. The result was instantaneous. A 1-second burst, 80 rounds, tore through the air like a beam of light. The Zero didn't just get hit. It ceased to exist. The tail section sheared off, the fuselage disintegrated, and the explosion flashed so bright that Sweat had to roll to avoid flying through the debris. Holy Mother! His voice cut off in the radio. He was already banking toward the next target. Another Zero. 320 feet. One burst. The left wing folded like paper. A third target, half a second of fire. The cockpit vanished. In less than a minute, 3 kills. The rest of the squadron hadn't even finished lining up their shots. Back at Bougainville, the radar operators listened in stunned silence as the combat chatter came through. The tone was different now, clipped, confident, controlled. No panic, no wasted words. Just results. The entire engagement lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, 8 Japanese aircraft were down. 5 of them took Captain Sweat alone. He returned to base with over half his ammunition still on board. When he landed, mechanics ran toward the plane, ducking under its still-spinning propeller. Sweat climbed out, removed his goggles, and said simply, "It works." McCarthy stood a few yards away, frozen in disbelief. He didn't cheer. He didn't salute. He just exhaled for the first time in hours. Major Wade Britt arrived seconds later. He didn't ask for permission. He just looked at McCarthy and said, "Can you do every plane like that?" McCarthy nodded. "Yes, sir." "Then do it." Lieutenant Colonel Millington stormed onto the scene, red-faced, waving a clipboard. "You can't authorize this. It violates structural protocol. Those guns will tear the wings apart." Britt didn't even look up. "You're welcome to write the report," he said. "I'll be flying it tomorrow." That night, the hangar glowed like a forge. McCarthy and his team worked without pause, torches sparking, hammers ringing against steel. Sweat slept nearby on a crate, still in his flight gear. The air smelled of hot metal and victory. By dawn, 22 Corsairs had been modified. Every gun sighted to 300 feet, every bracket reinforced by hand. They called it McCarthy's Fix, though officially it didn't exist. On the morning of September 20th, VMF 2113 scrambled again. This time, 8 Corsairs against 12 Zeros and 8 Betty bombers heading straight for Allied supply ships. The sky over Empress Augusta Bay lit up. Within seconds, Betty bombers erupted in fireballs. Japanese formations collapsed in confusion. The Corsairs moved like predators, cutting through the air with lethal precision. What once took hundreds of rounds now took dozens. A Zero pilot radioed his commander in panic. "The American guns, they shoot as one. There is no escape." By the end of the engagement, 15 enemy aircraft were destroyed. American losses, 0. The mission debrief confirmed the impossible. Ammunition expenditure per kill had dropped from 890 rounds to just 180. The squadron's kill-to-loss ratio skyrocketed overnight. From 3-1 to 11-1 on the ground, officers reviewed the gun camera footage, speechless. The tracers were no longer bursts. They were a continuous stream, a pillar of concentrated fire that melted aircraft mid-flight. One colonel muttered under his breath, "It looks like a laser," and in that moment, a sergeant with a wrench had done what engineers, officers, and tacticians could not. He had redefined the mathematics of death in the sky. For McCarthy, it was just physics. For everyone else, it was a miracle. Word of the miracle at Bougainville spread faster than any official report. Within 48 hours, every squadron in the Solomon Islands wanted the modification. Pilots who had once scoffed at armorers' tinkering now begged for it. The phrase 300-foot convergence became whispered gospel, a secret code for survival. In the days that followed, VMF 213 rewrote the rules of aerial combat. The Corsair, once dismissed as unruly and inaccurate, became the most feared machine in the Pacific sky. Its pilots no longer fired wild bursts from a distance. They waited, closing in until the enemy filled their gun sights. One heartbeat, one trigger press, one less enemy. At 11:40 hours, September 20th, 8 freshly modified Corsairs intercepted a new Japanese formation. Fordici no nahidan dadatin tron 13. 12 Zeros escorting 8 Betty bombers. Lieutenant Robert Hansen, a young pilot barely 21, made the first run. At 400 yards, he held fire. At 350, still nothing. At 300 feet, Santurt, and Tudi Danturi Fiern, he fired. 2 seconds of sustained burst. The Betty's right engine exploded in a flash of orange. The wing folded. The bomber plunged in flames, trailing a 100-foot tail of smoke. Hansen banked left, lined up on a 0, and fired a 1-second burst. The cockpit disintegrated. The plane nosed over into the ocean. 15 seconds. 2 kills. 240 rounds. By the time the engagement ended, 15 enemy aircraft were destroyed. Every bomber, every fighter, gone. American losses, 0. The footage was undeniable. When the films reached General Roy Geiger's desk, he replayed them again and again. What he saw defied belief. Solid beams of light streaking through enemy formations, planes breaking apart before tracers even faded. He forwarded the footage to Washington with a single remark: immediate replication advised. By the end of September, VMF 214, Pappy Boyington's Black Sheep Squadron, had adopted the same convergence. By October, every Marine fighter group in the Pacific was requesting it. By November 1943, it was standard practice. Combat statistics told the story better than any speech. Before McCarthy's fix, 3.2 to 1 kill ratio, 890 rounds per kill. After, 11.3 to 1 ratio viri, sapoider, modinbon ratio bari profound, 190 rounds per kill. Mission survivability increased by over 60%, the Japanese noticed. Radio intercepts carried a chilling new tone. The Americans' fire is like a wall of death. Do not engage the blue fighters below 500 meters. Captured enemy pilots confirmed it. One described the experience as facing the sun exploding in your face. Another said, "You don't dodge it, you just vanish." The psychological shock was immense. For the first time, Japanese aviators feared direct confrontation. Many began to abort missions rather than face Corsairs head-on. Meanwhile, back at Bougainville, Mickey McCarthy was still an enlisted sergeant, still loading ammunition, still tightening bolts on the flight line. He hadn't written a report, hadn't made a speech. He just kept working, as though nothing had changed. But everyone around him knew better. At the VMF 213 Christmas gathering later that year, Captain Sweat raised a glass in front of his men. "Most of you don't know this," he began, "but the reason we're all still standing here isn't the Corsair. It's not our flying. It's a man named Mickey McCarthy." He turned toward the quiet mechanic standing in the back. "He changed the way we fight. He made us dangerous." McCarthy looked down, embarrassed. "I just adjusted some bolts," he muttered, but the numbers didn't lie. In 4 months, the modification had saved hundreds of lives and turned the tide of the air war over the Pacific. By January 1944, Major Greg "Pappy" Boyington, already a legend, credited the fix for his record-breaking success. Before McCarthy's modification, he later wrote, "I was a good pilot with bad results. After it, every trigger pull was a kill." The Marine Corps would eventually make the 300-foot harmonization standard for every Corsair. Yet, in the official documentation, the credit went to the Bureau of Aeronautics Engineering Division. Not to the sergeant who had built it with scrap metal and intuition. McCarthy's name disappeared from the paperwork, but not from the memories of the men he'd saved. One pilot said years later, "He made the Corsair what it was meant to be, not just a plane, but a weapon of absolute certainty." From that point on, the Pacific belonged to the Americans. The Corsair's kill ratio soared. Its legend as Whistling Death was now justified not by design, but by defiance. And though few outside the squadrons ever knew his name, every pilot who strapped into that blue-winged beast knew they owed their life to a mechanic who refused to obey a manual. The war would move on, to Saipan, to Iwo Jima, to Okinawa, but the shadow of that night in 1943 stretched across them all. The innovation that began with a wrench and a whisper had become the defining weapon of the Pacific Air War. The war in the Pacific was a series of brutal lessons, and few came with results as immediate as McCarthy's. What began as an unauthorized modification in a dim Bougainville hangar became official policy within months. By February 1944, the U.S. Marine Corps adopted the 300-foot convergence as standard for all F-4U Corsairs. The Bureau of Aeronautics Engineers, the same ones who once called it unsafe, confirmed in post-war stress tests that McCarthy's improvised reinforcements had actually increased the airframe's durability. The irony was perfect. Officially, the new configuration was credited to BuAer Engineering Staff. No mention of a sergeant, no acknowledgement of the mechanic who had done it first. But among the pilots, there was no doubt who deserved the praise. At the VMF 2113 Christmas party, the men raised their glasses not to medals or missions, but to Mickey McCarthy. Captain Sweat, now an ace, stood and said, "Most of you don't know him. He's not a pilot. He's the man who loads our guns and fixes our planes. I'm alive because he ignored orders." McCarthy, standing at the back of the room, looked uncomfortable under the applause. "I just adjusted some bolts," he murmured. But those bolts had changed everything. From September to December 1943, Marine Corsair squadrons in the Solomon Islands shot down 487 confirmed enemy aircraft, while losing just 43 of their own, an unprecedented 11-to-1 kill ratio. Ammunition efficiency improved by over 350%, meaning more pilots returned with rounds left instead of dying empty. More importantly, it changed the psychology of air combat. Pilots stopped seeing themselves as outgunned. The Corsair went from underdog to executioner. McCarthy's modification also influenced future aircraft designs. Post-war engineers studying his convergence geometry found that the denser fire pattern reduced engagement time and improved survival odds. It inspired the M350 cal, a faster-firing evolution of the Browning, and later fed into rotary concepts that led to the M134 minigun decades later. But in 1943, none of that mattered to McCarthy. He still lived in a tent, still worked 14-hour days cleaning the same guns he'd improved. He never spoke of what he'd done. To him, it wasn't invention. It was maintenance, the kind that kept his friends alive. The official paperwork never carried his name. His commanding officers received commendations for technical initiative in field adaptation. McCarthy received nothing. No medal, No promotion, just another assignment, another wing to maintain, another war to endure. Yet every Marine who climbed into a Corsair after Bougainville carried his legacy unknowingly. When they fired their guns and saw enemy aircraft vanish in bursts of flame, they were witnessing the work of a man the Corps had already forgotten. Years later, a surviving pilot said, "He was the deadliest Marine who never pulled a trigger." In that single sentence lay the quiet truth of Mickey McCarthy's genius, and the tragedy of how war remembers its heroes. By early 1944, the Pacific skies belonged to the Americans. The Corsair had finally become the monster it was meant to be: sleek, fast, and utterly lethal. But few who saw its new efficiency understood where that transformation began. In a hangar, under a single light, in the hands of a sergeant who didn't follow the rules. As the war pressed westward, through the Marshalls, the Marianas, and into the Philippines, the McCarthy convergence became gospel. Marine and Navy pilots alike requested it by name. Ordnance officers called it Field Adaptation Protocol. But everyone in the cockpit called it what it truly was: salvation. The statistics proved its impact. Before the modification, Corsair squadrons averaged a kill ratio of 3-to-1. After McCarthy's fix, the ratio soared to 11-to-1, mirroring the aircraft's final official wartime record. Ammunition expenditure dropped by nearly 70%. Pilot survival doubled. It was as if someone had rewritten the laws of aerial combat. But when the credits were tallied, Mickey McCarthy's name was missing. The Bureau of Aeronautics 1944 Modification Manual, the one that officially standardized the 300-foot harmonization, bore the signatures of engineers who had never set foot in Bougainville. McCarthy's name appeared nowhere. His contribution, like the countless rounds fired by the guns he had fixed, vanished into the smoke of history. He didn't fight it. He didn't even seem to care. When the war ended in 1945, Staff Sergeant Michael Joseph McCarthy returned home to Boston. He opened a small garage on Dorchester Avenue, married a schoolteacher named Helen, and went back to fixing engines, trading Corsairs for Chevrolets. He never spoke about the war. When asked what he did in the Marines, he'd shrug and say, "Loaded ammo." Nothing special, but the men who flew his weapons knew the truth. Captain James Sweat, who became a Medal of Honor recipient and a Marine Corps legend, wrote in his 1989 memoir, "People call me an ace, a hero." The truth is simpler. I had a plane with guns that worked the way they should have from the beginning. A sergeant nobody's heard of made that happen. Mickey McCarthy made me an ace. The Corps should have given him the Navy Cross. They gave him nothing. That's not right. Lieutenant Robert Hansen, who scored 25 kills before being shot down in 1944, wrote home to his family weeks before his death. "There's a sergeant here who changed everything. If I make it home, I'm buying him a drink." He never made it home. Decades later, McCarthy's name surfaced again, quietly, without ceremony. In 1987, the Marine Corps Aviation Association installed a plaque at the National Museum of the Marine Corps honoring unsung heroes of marine aviation. Among the 87 names inscribed at the bottom, one stood out: SSG Michael McCarthy, VMF 213 Ordnance Crew. No description, no citation, just a name. Yet, for those who knew, it was enough. Every Marine pilot who walked past that plaque understood what those small letters meant. They meant precision. They meant survival. They meant that somewhere, a man with a wrench had once changed the sky. McCarthy died in 1979 of a heart attack at age 62. His obituary in the Boston Globe was 3 sentences long. It mentioned he was a Marine veteran, and nothing more. But his legacy endured in every aircraft that came after. The same principle of close-range convergence, of focusing overwhelming firepower into a single decisive moment became standard across modern aviation. The P-51 Mustang, P-47 Thunderbolt, and even the F-16 Fighting Falcon carried echoes of his geometry. He never lived to see it. But every time a pilot pulled the trigger and watched a perfect pattern of fire hit its mark, they were repeating what he'd proven on that distant island in 1943, that a single act of defiance, guided by precision and courage, could change the course of a war. War remembers its heroes in medals and monuments, but it often forgets the quiet ones, the men who never stood in the spotlight, but without whom the victories would never have come. Staff Sergeant Michael "Mickey" McCarthy was one of them. He didn't lead squadrons or command battalions. He didn't carry a rifle into the jungle or a medal on his chest. What he carried was understanding of machines, of failure, of how small adjustments could mean the difference between a man living to see another dawn or vanishing into the Pacific. In a war that measured progress in miles of coral and bodies per beach, McCarthy's innovation was invisible, yet it saved more lives than most battles won. His 300-foot convergence was more than a mechanical adjustment. It was the embodiment of a simple truth. Sometimes, the line between survival and loss isn't courage or firepower. It's understanding. That principle never left the Marine Corps. It shaped every weapon system that came after. From machine guns to miniguns, from airframes to missiles. The philosophy remained the same. Concentrate precision where it matters most. But McCarthy himself never sought recognition. He was a product of his generation, one that valued results over reward. He went home, back to his garage, back to the sound of wrenches instead of gunfire. The world moved on. Yet every time a pilot took off in a jet fighter with harmonized weapons, every time the tracers met exactly where they were meant to, a fragment of his legacy lived again. He proved that heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it happens under a single lamp in a hot, silent hangar. One man, one wrench, one act of defiance. In the grand story of the Second World War, where generals moved divisions and fleets decided empires, Mickey McCarthy reminded history of something simpler. That victory is often built not by those who give orders, but by those who understand why they shouldn't always be obeyed. And for that, the Marine who never pulled a trigger changed the way war would be fought forever.